By early 1942, American pilots knew a secret they weren't supposed to admit. They were losing. Not battles, not campaigns, but the sky itself. Over the Pacific, Japanese A6M0 fighters were cutting U.S. Navy squadrons apart with terrifying efficiency. They climbed faster, turned tighter, stayed in the air longer. And every American pilot knew the truth the manuals refused to print. If a Zero got behind you, you're already dead. On paper, the U.S. Navy still believed in individual skill. One pilot, one enemy, one victory. Doctrine preached aggressive dogfighting, tight turns, personal marksmanship. It sounded heroic. It was also getting men killed. On June 4th, 1942, as the Battle of Midway began to unfold, Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thach flew toward combat, knowing his outdated F-4F Wildcat was inferior in nearly every measurable way. He had no faster engine, no tighter turn radius. No tecnologique el miracle. What he did have was something the Navy had never taught. A plan to survive. Not win, not dominate. Survive. Months earlier, Thach had sketched a maneuver using matchsticks on a table. A desperate idea built on cooperation instead of heroics. Two planes, crossing paths, covering each other's blind spots. It violated everything fighter doctrine stood for. It also worked, at least on paper. Now, over the Pacific, Thach had second to find out if his idea would save lives or doom his entire division. Japanese fighters appeared ahead. Sleek, confident, hunting. Thach keyed his radio. "Stay with me," he told his wingman. Calm, measured, almost casual. The Zero pilots expected the usual response. Panic, brake turns, men trying to outfly aircraft they couldn't beat. Instead, the Americans did something no enemy had ever seen before. They flew toward each other, and in that instant, invisible to history, undocumented in any manual, modern air combat changed forever. Subscribe now for real WW2 moments where one decision rewrote the rules of war. To understand why Thach's idea was so dangerous and so necessary, you have to understand the terror of facing a Zero in 1942. Japanese naval aviators didn't just fly better aircraft. They flew with absolute confidence. The A6M0 could outclimb, outturn, and outrange anything the U.S. Navy had in the air. Its pilots were veterans of China, hardened by years of combat before America ever fired a shot. They knew exactly what American pilots would do, because Americans always did the same thing. They turned. Every instinct in a fighter pilot screamed to turn harder, tighter, faster. But the Zero thrived in turning fights. American Wildcats bled speed. Engines overheated. Controls stiffened. And then the tracers came. Survivors described the same moment again and again. The sudden shadow across the cockpit canopy. The vibration. The realization that the enemy wasn't in front of them anymore. He was behind. U.S. intelligence knew the Zero was superior. Engineers knew it. Pilots knew it. But doctrine lagged behind reality, as it always does in war. The official solution was vague and deadly. Avoid prolonged engagement. Use teamwork where possible. No explanation. No method. No survival plan. That terrified Thach, because he understood something many commanders didn't. Pilots don't die because they lack courage. They die because they follow bad assumptions too long. So Thach began thinking like the enemy. Japanese pilots expected isolation. They expected panic. They expected each American pilot to fight alone. What they didn't expect was discipline. In his spare hours, Thach arranged matchsticks on a table. 2 American planes, 1 enemy fighter. He imagined attack angles, overshoots, blind spots. Slowly, a pattern emerged. If 2 Wildcats crossed paths at the right moment, any Zero chasing one would be forced to fly into the guns of the other. Not by speed, not by turning ability, but by geometry. It required absolute trust, perfect timing. One mistake meant collision or death. No manual approved it. No superior endorsed it. But Thach trained his men anyway, quietly, under the guise of formation drills. He didn't tell them it would save their lives. He told them it might. Now, over midway, Japanese pilots closed in, confident, aggressive, deadly. They had never seen what Thach was about to do. The Pacific below was calm. Deceptively calm. A blue emptiness stretching endlessly in every direction. Above it, chaos arrived at closing speed. Thach saw the Zero first. It dropped in from above and behind. Exactly as expected, its pilot confident enough to line up a clean kill. Thach didn't break. He didn't turn hard. He didn't dive. Instead, he gave a single, quiet command. Cross. Every instinct screamed that flying toward another aircraft in combat was madness. But training took over. The two Wildcats turned inward. To the Japanese pilot, it looked like panic. Two Americans flying straight into each other, about to collide. He committed, pushing for the kill, rolling in tighter, convinced he was watching his prey self-destruct. Then the geometry snapped shut. As Thach crossed his wingman's path, the Zero suddenly found itself exposed. Not behind one target, but directly in front of another. Tracer fire erupted from the Wildcat the Japanese pilot hadn't been watching. The Zero screamed past, narrowly escaping destruction. But something far more important had happened. The illusion of superiority had cracked. The Japanese pilot pulled up, confused. He had done everything right. His enemy should have been dead. Instead, he was alive and, worse, coordinated. The Zero came around again. So did the Americans. Again they crossed. Again the trap formed. Again the Zero was forced to break away. This wasn't a dogfight anymore. It was a pattern. Other Wildcats nearby saw it happening. Confusion turned into imitation. Two plane elements began copying the movement instinctively, without orders, without permission. Pairs crossed. Zeros overshot. Guns flashed. Within minutes, Japanese pilots realized something was wrong. Their usual advantage, getting behind a lone American, no longer guaranteed a kill. Every attack carried risk. Every chase exposed them to unseen guns. The psychological balance shifted. This wasn't about destroying the enemy. It was about denying them certainty. Thach's radio crackled with voices, strained, breathless, alive. "It works," one pilot said. "They can't stay behind us," another shouted. Thach kept his voice calm. "Stay disciplined. Keep weaving." What he didn't say was that the maneuver was still fragile. Timing mattered. Distance mattered. Trust mattered. One mistake could unravel everything, but it didn't. By the time the engagement ended, Wildcats that should have been lost were still flying. Zeros disengaged, something almost unthinkable earlier that year. The Americans hadn't outflown the enemy. They had outthought them. And somewhere between those crossing flight paths, U.S. naval aviation found its future. The battle moved on. Aircraft returned low on fuel. Deck crews scrambled. Pilots climbed out of cockpits shaking, soaked in sweat, adrenaline still roaring through their veins. But something was different. Men who should have been dead were walking. In the ready rooms that night, pilots didn't talk about victories. They talked about moments, the instant a Zero overshot, the flash of tracers that forced an enemy break, the relief of knowing someone was watching their tail. Thach said little. He listened, and then he did something quietly revolutionary. He wrote it down. Not a heroic report, not a boast. A technical explanation, angles, spacing, timing, describing exactly how the crossing maneuver worked, why it worked, and under what conditions it would fail. That mattered, because the U.S. Navy had a problem bigger than losing aircraft. It had a learning problem. Combat lessons were slow to travel. Pilots rotated home. Reports disappeared into filing cabinets. By the time doctrine updated, wars were already lost. Thach bypassed the system. He taught the maneuver directly, face to face, chalkboard to chalkboard, squadron to squadron. He showed pilots how to trust each other when instinct told them not to, how to surrender the illusion of individual mastery for collective survival. At first, some resisted. Fighter pilots were trained to be predators, lone hunters with fast reflexes and sharp eyes. The idea that survival depended on another man's timing felt wrong, but the numbers didn't lie. Units that adopted the Weave came back with more aircraft, more pilots, fewer funerals. Word spread. By late 1942, squadrons across the Pacific were practicing the maneuver openly. By 1943, it had a name, the Thach Weave. No longer an improvisation, no longer unofficial. Now it was doctrine. Japanese pilots noticed the change too. Engagements grew longer. Kill ratios dropped. Surprise faded. The sky was no longer a place of guaranteed dominance. All because one commander questioned a single assumption. That air combat was about individual brilliance. It wasn't. It was about cooperation under pressure. The Japanese were not slow learners. Within weeks, intelligence reports began filtering back through American channels. Enemy pilots were changing their behavior. They no longer committed as aggressively. They probed. They feinted. Some attempted vertical attacks, diving through the weave instead of staying behind it. The sky had become contested in a new way. Japanese instructors warned their pilots. American fighters are no longer alone. The phrase appeared again and again in after-action summaries. The Zero still had advantages, but its greatest weapon, certainty, was gone. That mattered more than armor or speed. In combat, hesitation is fatal. Zeros now broke off attacks they would have pressed months earlier. They climbed away instead of finishing runs. They circled, searching for openings that didn't exist. And while Japanese pilots hesitated, American pilots survived. The Thach Weave wasn't magic. It didn't make the Wildcat faster or lighter. It didn't erase the Zero's performance edge. What it did was force the enemy to fight on unfamiliar terms. And in war, unfamiliarity kills. Thach understood this deeply. He warned his pilots not to become complacent. If it stops working, he told them, we change again. That mindset, adaptation over tradition, was spreading. Other tactics emerged alongside the Weave. Boom and zoom attacks, disciplined disengagement, altitude control. American air combat was becoming systematic, analytical, almost scientific. The Japanese had relied on mastery of the individual aircraft. The Americans were building systems. By late 1942, kill ratios began to shift. Not dramatically, not instantly, but consistently. The bleeding slowed. Experience accumulated instead of being buried at sea. And something else happened, quieter, but just as important. Pilots began to trust each other completely. They stopped flying as heroes. They flew as pairs. That trust carried consequences far beyond Midway. It laid the foundation for how the U.S. Navy would fight for the rest of the war, and for how air forces would think about cooperation forever. The Weave was no longer just a maneuver. It was a philosophy. What began as matchsticks on a table didn't stay in the cockpit. By early 1943, the Thach Weave had moved into classrooms, training films, and briefing rooms across the U.S. Navy. New pilots learned it before they ever fired a shot in anger. Veteran pilots refined it, arguing over spacing and timing, adjusting it for altitude and speed. For the first time in the Pacific Air War, training was catching up to reality. Thach himself was uneasy with the attention. He knew how fragile success could be. Tactics hardened into dogma too easily. What worked today could fail tomorrow. So he insisted on one thing above all else: understanding over memorization. Pilots weren't just told what to do. They were taught why it worked. The geometry, the psychology, the enemy's expectations. If the situation changed, they were expected to change too. That expectation reshaped American air combat culture. Fighter doctrines stopped worshiping the lone ace and started valuing coordination, communication, and mutual protection. Radios mattered. Formation discipline mattered. Survival mattered. The Thach Weave spread beyond Wildcats. Hellcats, Corsairs, new aircraft, new speeds, same principle. Never fight alone if you don't have to. Even the enemy acknowledged it. Post-war Japanese pilot interviews revealed frustration bordering on disbelief. The Americans, they said, had become difficult to isolate. The sky had become crowded with unseen threats. That shift had consequences on the ground and at sea. Bombers reached targets more often. Fleets stayed covered. Loss rates dropped. All because one commander trusted an idea that didn't exist in any manual. But Thach never claimed genius. He called it necessity. War, he believed, was not won by perfect plans, but by the courage to abandon bad ones fast enough. Subscribe for real WW2 stories where adaptation, not tradition, decided the outcome. The real impact of the Thach Weave didn't appear in communiques or headlines. It appeared in empty bunks that stayed empty. Pilots who should have been replacement statistics were flying second, third, fourth combat tours. Men who would have died in their first engagement were now instructors, passing on hard-earned instincts to the next wave. This mattered more than any single battle, because air warfare isn't won by moments. It's won by experience accumulation. And for the first time in the Pacific, American pilots were surviving long enough to become dangerous. They learned when to brake, when to disengage, when to trust their wingmen instead of their reflexes. The Weave created something Japanese training struggled to replicate: interchangeable skill. If one pilot went down, the formation still functioned. Knowledge lived in the system, not the individual. Japanese doctrine, by contrast, still revolved around elite mastery. Their aces were deadly, but irreplaceable. When they were lost, their experience vanished with them. American squadrons noticed the difference in the air. Zeros still attacked, but less decisively. Pilots hesitated before committing. Some broke off at the first sign of crossing aircraft, unwilling to gamble against unseen guns. Fear had changed sides. One U.S. pilot later said the Weave didn't make him brave. It made him calm, and calm pilots think faster, shoot straighter, and live longer. Thach watched this evolution quietly. He didn't seek credit. He measured success in voices still answering roll call. When asked later how he felt seeing his idea spread, he said simply, "It kept men alive long enough to get better." That was enough. By mid-1943, the sky over the Pacific felt different. Not safer, not quiet, but predictable. American pilots began to sense it before they could explain it. The way Japanese fighters hesitated at the edge of an attack. The way once aggressive dives turned into probing passes. The Zero was still dangerous, but it no longer dictated the fight, because the Weave had done something subtle and devastating. It broke the enemy's rhythm. Japanese air tactics relied on momentum, decisive entry, tight pursuit, rapid kill. The Thach Weave forced every engagement to slow down, fragment, and reset. Each reset gave Americans something precious. Time. Time to climb. Time to call warnings. Time to bring friends into the fight. And in air combat, time is life. As newer American aircraft entered service, faster, tougher, better armed, the Weave didn't disappear. It adapted. Pilots modified spacing, timing, altitude. The core idea remained untouched. Never present a single target. Never fight alone. Never give the enemy the fight he expects. By late 1943, American carrier air groups were operating with confidence the Navy hadn't felt since before Pearl Harbor. Losses still happened. War never stops taking, but the imbalance was gone. Japanese pilots felt it too. Post-war accounts describe increasing frustration. Engagements that once ended in seconds now dragged on. Ammunition ran out. Fuel dwindled. Wingmen were lost trying to break formations that refused to break. The Americans weren't better pilots individually. They were better together. And that truth reached far beyond the Pacific. Air forces around the world studied the maneuver after the war. NATO taught variations of it. Modern fighter doctrine still echoes its logic. Mutual support, cross-coverage, denial of pursuit. All born from desperation. All born from one moment when a commander chose cooperation over instinct. World War II loved heroes. Posters. Headlines. Kill counts painted on fuselages. The image of the lone ace, fearless, unmatched, victorious, dominated the public imagination. It was clean. It was simple. It was also dangerously misleading. The Thach Weave quietly dismantled that myth. Not by argument, by results. As the war progressed, the most successful American pilots were no longer the ones who chased glory. They were the ones who stayed in formation, watched their radios, and trusted procedures as much as instincts. Kills mattered less than coverage. Protection mattered more than pursuit. In debriefs, commanders stopped asking who shot him down and started asking, why do we all come back? This shift reshaped how the Navy selected, trained, and evaluated pilots. Recklessness was no longer bravery. Discipline became the new courage. Japanese doctrine struggled to make the same transition. Their system still elevated individual mastery, still celebrated singular skill. But war had become industrial, systemic, unforgiving, and systems beat individuals. The sky over the Pacific didn't belong to heroes anymore. It belonged to teams. Thach understood this better than anyone. He rarely spoke about the maneuver in emotional terms. To him, it wasn't clever or elegant. It was necessary, a response to reality rather than tradition. When asked years later if he thought the Weave was his greatest contribution, he paused before answering. No, he said, survival was. That answer explains everything. By the end of World War II, the Thach Weave was no longer remarkable. That was its greatest success. It had become so embedded in training that pilots executed it without thinking. The ultimate sign that a lesson had been learned properly. New aircraft, new engines, new wars. The principle remained unchanged. Modern air combat no longer resembles Midway. Missiles have replaced machine guns. Radar sees beyond human vision. Engagements begin long before pilots ever see each other. And yet, the logic of the Weave still governs the sky. Mutual support, cross-coverage, denial of pursuit, forcing the enemy into predictable reactions. Every modern fighter tactic echoes the same truth Thach uncovered with matchsticks. No matter how advanced the technology, war is still about decision-making under pressure. The Weave mattered because it was born in fear, not arrogance. Because it acknowledged weakness instead of denying it. Because it assumed the enemy was smart and adapted accordingly. That mindset won the Pacific Air War. Not a single maneuver, not a single aircraft, but a culture willing to discard pride for survival. Thach never sought fame. He finished the war, served his country, and lived quietly. No monuments bear his name. No movies dramatize the moment two wildcats crossed paths in the sky. But thousands of pilots lived because they did. And every time modern pilots train to protect each other instead of chasing the kill, they're repeating that invisible moment. The instant when American air power stopped trying to outfight the enemy and started out-thinking him. There was no ceremony when the Thach Weave became standard. No announcement over loudspeakers. No headline declaring a revolution in the sky. That's how real change usually happens in war. It spreads quietly, through checklists, briefings, habits. Through the way pilots instinctively slide closer to a wingman without being told. Through the way radios stay calm even when tracers start cutting the air. By 1944, young American pilots entered combat assuming mutual protection was normal. They couldn't imagine flying any other way. The idea of fighting alone felt reckless, outdated, almost primitive. That was the true victory. Because the most powerful weapon the Thach Weave created wasn't a maneuver. It was trust. Trust that someone else would cover you. Trust that discipline could beat instinct. Trust that survival didn't require heroics. And that trust scaled. Carrier groups coordinated more tightly. Escort tactics matured. Bombers flew deeper with greater confidence. Losses still came. War never spares everyone. But the era of helplessness was over. The sky no longer belonged to whoever had the better aircraft. It belonged to whoever adapted faster. After the war, historians would debate turning points, Midway, Guadalcanal, the Marianas. But none of those victories were possible without the invisible groundwork laid earlier when American pilots stopped trying to win every fight and focused on coming home alive. Thach once reflected on that first engagement where the Weave worked. He didn't describe excitement. He didn't describe triumph. He described relief. Because relief meant the idea had worked, and working meant lives saved. Thousands of them. The Thach Weave didn't end the war, but it gave the men fighting it something priceless. a future beyond their first mission. History usually remembers the loud moments, the explosions, the victories, the names etched into stone. But the most important changes often happen in silence, in decisions made too quickly for ceremony, too practically for legend. The Thach Weave was one of those moments. No camera captured it. No reporter witnessed it. No one knew, in that instant, that air combat doctrine had just shifted. Two aircraft crossed paths. That was all. Yet inside that crossing was a radical idea, that survival was not an individual achievement, but a shared responsibility. That war rewarded those who adapted fastest, not those who clung hardest to tradition. The Zero never became harmless. The sky never became safe. But the balance changed, and balance is often enough. Today, fighter pilots train for scenarios far removed from 1942. Speeds are supersonic. Weapons are beyond sight. Computers assist decisions once made by instinct alone. Still, instructors teach the same foundational truth Jimmy Thach uncovered under fire. Never fight alone if you can help it. That lesson, born from fear, refined by discipline, proven by survival, outlived the war that created it. It's easy to romanticize World War II, harder to learn from it. The Thach Weave reminds us that progress rarely comes from brilliance alone. It comes from humility, from admitting weakness, questioning assumptions, and trusting others when instinct says don't. That is how the sky was reclaimed. Not by a better airplane, not by a faster gun, but by two pilots choosing cooperation over pride. And that choice still echoes every time aircraft rise together into hostile airspace. Watching each other's blind spots, sharing risk, and proving again and again that the most powerful weapon in war is adaptation.